Welcome to Writing the West podcast. I'm your host, Tyler Offhammer with Cowboys and Indians magazine, and our guest this week is Beau L'Amour, son of famed Western novelist Louis L'Amour. Beau joins us to discuss the newly restored book, Rivers West, and the deeper creative vision behind the Lost Treasures series. Oh, welcome back to Writing the West podcast. Earlier this year, we got to talk a lot about your father's legacy, your stewardship of his legacy, and we very momentarily touched on the Lost Treasures series. And this time we get to zero in on Rivers West, which is the latest release in the Lost Treasures series. Why was Rivers West the right title to revisit next?
Well, it's the one that's being published now. I'm sort of joking. I mean, that's what we're doing. But Rivers West is a really, really good one to talk about because, well, first let me explain what Lost Treasures is, and then
Please.
you'll see why. Okay, so the Louis L'Amour's Lost Treasures series is first and foremost postscripts that are going into many of the old Louis L'Amour novels and books of short stories. I think I have done 30 of them now. There'll probably be a few more. So 30 of the books have a postscript in them that's kind of like the making of, or the story behind the story, or stories that are associated with this story that are interesting. And sometimes those will be they're all different. So sometimes it will be, maybe this is something about dad doing research on a particular story, and I happen to have documents, I have letters that he wrote or received, I have material that he created in one way or another, maybe a early beginning to the story, maybe just notes that he made on it. We have a Lost Treasures that goes very in depth on Last of the Breed, but the Lost Treasures for Last of the Breed actually includes a short story that he initially intended to be kind of the hinge point, kind of the character development point for that character. And somehow, in his enthusiasm for writing the book, he left it out. And when you read it, you kind of go, oh wow, this is really, this is really this terribly important moment right in the middle of the story that came from that short story. Sometimes the Lost Treasures material might be about what happened after the book was written, how it was received, or how the movie was made, things like that. I'll go into whatever it was that happened after we went on and did the book, if there's something interesting there. Obviously, there isn't something interesting for every single book, or I would be doing every single book. I don't want to waste anybody's money or try to suggest that somebody buy something where I'm kind of spinning my wheels and making something up to add Lost Treasures material that's not meaningful. In the case of Rivers West, well, let me back up and say there's also two books called Louis L'Amour's Lost Treasures Volumes 1 and 2. And those are mostly, there's some finished stuff in there, but those are mostly unfinished stories. And then after the unfinished story, I will go in and talk about, why it's unfinished, what Louis had problems with doing, what he was trying to do by writing that particular thing, how it was going to fit into his career. In a couple of cases, we have several different attempts at the same story, so you can see the difference between the things he was trying. One of those in there's a beginning as a novel. There's also a beginning that's a pilot for a television series, some various other things like that. So the Louis L'Amour's Lost Treasures Volumes 1 and 2 have all of these unfinished works. And then there's one last book, the No Traveler Returns, which is my dad's first novel that was left unfinished, that I went in and did quite a bit of work to finish it up. So that's how the Lost Treasures series lays out. And Rivers West is a really good one to talk about as a postscript book, because it was a novel that was published back in the mid 1970s. And it was very heavily edited. And my dad complained about, I'll go back and tell you the story about this in a second, but dad complained about that. And there was some adjusting of things that were going on in the publishing situation. He had kind of he had trouble with several different books that were being edited at that point. So anyway, with Lost Treasures, I thought, well, this is the perfect opportunity to go back and re-edit that book. Go back to all the original material that was originally there and look at it and see exactly what he thought the problem was with the editing, because it was never fixed throughout the years. And that I would have the chance to, to put material back in, to fix it up, and to try to create kind of a restored version of it. So of all the Lost Treasures books, it's got kind of a more dramatic story behind it. And now I'll pass the baton back to you for a second if you've got any questions, and I can go on from there, but there you go.
Yeah, well, and what strikes me initially is during your dad's lifetime, he went on book tours, he gave some interviews, but especially in the time in which he was writing that we're speaking about with Rivers West in the 70s, there was no way of fans, shooting a Twitter message and saying, "Hey, why did you make this choice?" or so on. And it's giving us such a revealing insight into the process, not only of his writing, but also, like you said, the editorial process at the publishing houses and things like that. Was there anything, whether it be the revisions or maybe conceptual shifts in his writing process, that really made this edition unique compared to the other Lost Treasures books? And
Not
maybe not.
necessarily, yeah, not necessarily this book, but what you're saying is correct. It's just kind of the differences are kind of subtle.
Okay.
In the late 1950s and early 1960s, Dad was fairly successful writing Westerns. He'd written a dozen, maybe a couple more successful Western books. They were selling well. And he wanted to branch out and write adventure stories of different types, historical novels. This is the time period when The Walking Drum was originally written, even though it wasn't published for 25 years.
Wow.
And he did not have any success in that. He tried to break out. Publishers weren't interested. And primarily the publishers, I mean, this is something I've learned in the intro, maybe even since I spoke with you last. The publishers weren't particularly interested because of a thing that had gone on in the book business at this time. So paperbacks originally were racked by publisher. So if you went into a newsstand or a drugstore or many bookstores, you would find all of the Bantam books and all of the Dell books, all of those together. And that's how you found your favorite authors and things like that. And by the late 1950s, the paperback business, which really got rolling in the early 1950s, was so prolific, and there were so many titles out there that they were filling up bookstores, and those racks were becoming really kind of redundant and awkward. And they decided that they were going to go through a process, kind of amusingly, for the late 1950s called integration. And they were going to integrate all of the different publishers and all of the writers. And from then on, the books would be found in categories based on their genre. And as soon as that happened, there was a lot of pressure for authors to never change their genre, because otherwise it was very difficult to find them in the bookstore. And so right at the time that my dad decided, okay, I've written a bunch of Westerns, now let's experiment with The Walking Drum, now let's experiment with this other thing. The pressure came on. It's like, no, you can't do that. You just have to write Westerns, because nobody will be able to find you. It'll be a bust if you do something like that. And he was dismayed. He had been working on a number of projects, some of which we'll talk about later, I think. And but he realized the reality of it. And he also realized that he didn't want to compromise the success that he'd had. He was, he was in his late 50s or early 60s and was still struggling. He had his first child on the way, and he was in his early 50s at that point. And he didn't want to take too many chances, so he went back to writing westerns. But he got this idea that what he would do is he would try to expand the parameters of the Western genre. And he would, I think his first attempt to do this was Shalico, which was a Western about a bunch of Europeans on safari in the West, just like they would be on safari in Africa. And that was it was a thing that happened, but I don't think anybody had ever written about it before. And it was maybe a little controversial at the time. The Western genre is very, very brittle. Fans do not, they want new material, they want it to be different, and they don't want it to be different at all.
Change the names.
they want it to be absolutely what they expect, and they still want it to be unique and different and entertaining, in all those ways. And so, he did this safari in New Mexico story, and it was a little bit controversial at that time. When the movie came out, like 5 years later, it was very controversial. It was like, fans were like blowing up over it. And it was also a European film. So it starred Sean Connery and Bridget Bardot and Honor Blackman, who's not necessarily European, I think she was American, but she had been in a Bond movie. And
by association.
yeah. And so it caused all this hoopla, like, what are all these foreigners doing in a Western? That's, as if nobody from anywhere else ever came to the United States. And but anyway, he started kind of expanding the genre a little bit. Then a few years later, he did The Broken Gun, which was a modern, like early 60s set mystery that had kind of a Western history to it, an Old West history to it. And then he wrote Riley's Luck a few years after that, which was a Western in which a moderate amount of the action in it takes place in Europe. And finally, in the early 70s, got around to writing the Ferguson rifle, which did not occur in Europe or anything like that, but it was set much earlier, just after the Revolutionary War. So it wasn't a traditional Western.
Right.
Then he wrote the Californios, which was early California, pre-Mexican War California. And so again, early time period. And it kind of contained some science fiction elements. Yeah. So he kept kind of taking the genre and kind of tugging it, trying to kind of open up a hole that he could drive a more interesting story through. And eventually he got around to doing what became the first Sackett story, Sackett's Land, and which is set in the 1600s. And about the first Sackett coming to North America, and then its immediate sequel to The Far Blue Mountains. Now, once he'd done that, I think the next one was probably Rivers West. So it's a good moment to discuss this. Rivers West is also set kind of early. I think it starts in Canada. It definitely starts in the Northeast. It's been a while since I read it. I know it's just coming out now, but when I did this Lost Treasures and sent it in to the publisher, and it kind of got lost for a couple of years. And I eventually called them up at a certain point, and I was like, I know I did this. Where is it? What happened? So anyway, it takes place in the 1820s, late 18 teens, early 1820s, and it's kind of referring to an incident in American history that's really fascinating. There were several different people who attempted to take over the Louisiana Purchase in the early days. The most notorious of which, and uh, I'm going to tell the craziest version of this story. All
That's
right.
great.
I don't know that this is all perfectly historically accurate. I know people have claimed what I'm about to tell, and I'm not swearing to you that it's the most verifiable historical account. Okay. And but if you thought American politics was turbulent today, just wait till you hear this. Okay. Thomas Jefferson is president. So this is considerably earlier than my dad's story. This is early 1800s, not 1819, 1820. Thomas Jefferson is president. Aaron Burr is the vice president. Aaron Burr fights a duel with Alexander Hamilton and kills him. And now the vice president of the United States is on the run from the authorities in several different states for both dueling and maybe manslaughter. He is sneaking into the White House to confer with Thomas Jefferson, like going through the back window.
Wow.
All right. And he also had a buddy who was a general. I shouldn't say a buddy. He had a guy on his secret payroll, on his bribery list, who was a general who was head of the Department of the West.
Okay.
And he was vice president, but he was kind of miffed about being vice president because in those days, the vice president was the loser of the two people that ran.
Right.
Okay. So this would be like Kamala Harris would be vice president today.
Right.
And so although he got along with Jefferson.
What could go wrong?
Yeah, exactly. He got along with Jefferson, but he was still burned about not being like having become a super important person.
Right.
And so he had this connection with the general who was head of the Department of the West. And that guy eventually was sort of told by Aaron Burr, so the story goes, to foment a war with Spain in the West so that an army would be sent from the United States into the Louisiana Purchase to defend the Louisiana Purchase from Spain. And then Aaron Burr would somehow go out there, take charge of that army, and turn it into his army to basically grab the Louisiana Purchase as his own kingdom, literally elevating him to royalty.
Wow.
As I understand this from this quite radical version of the story, the Zebulon Pike expedition, for whom Pikes Peak is named for, was actually sent out there as one of these attempts to piss off the Mexicans, so not the Mexicans, the Spanish in those days.
Right.
And but at the same time, the general who was head of the Department of the West was taking bribes also from the Spanish, and to keep getting more money, he was making sure that the American patrols and the Spanish patrols missed one another.
Oh my gosh.
So he didn't want a war to start because he wanted both sides to keep paying him. So Rivers West is kind of based on that. The bad guy in Rivers West is a sort of Aaron Burr type of character who is attempting this kind of filibustering, kind of mercenary takeover of the Louisiana Purchase.
Right. Wow.
So,
wow.
Yeah.
And of course, the Mississippi River being a central part of all of that.
Well, it's super important to understand. I mean, this is something that is touched on in my dad's work, and I touched on it a little bit more in the in the postscript. But I think it's extremely important for people to recognize what we call manifest destiny. This basically attempt to colonize the entirety of kind of this swath of North America. Basically buying it from France, taking it from Mexico, taking it not so much by force, but eventually by kind of coercion, the Oregon Territory from Canada or England, depending on how you see that. So that was also a big conflict in the 1830s. The idea that the United States was going to take Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, modern Idaho, Oregon, and Washington from Canada.
Right.
And controlling that space was extremely important strategically. When the United States didn't know who was out there, and they weren't worried about the Native Americans. They were worried about Europeans.
Right.
And they were worried about the French. They were worried about the Spanish and the Mexicans. They were worried about the British, particularly.
Right.
And the idea that there was this vast space that made them vulnerable was probably something that kept people up at night.
Yeah.
And then the Mississippi-Missouri basin, which is absolutely the most gigantic and productive waterway in the world, maybe second only to the Great Lakes, there had to have been people who saw that and basically said, well, look at the civilizations along the Nile, look at the civilizations along the Euphrates. Think about what modern industry, even 19th century industry,
right,
could do with that waterway, especially in an era without railroads.
Right.
It must have looked like the answer to everything. I mean, nobody knew how to go out and deal with it quite yet.
We weren't sure what we were going to do when we got it, but
yeah, exactly. But you look at it and you just kind of go, oh no, that is enormous, enormous potential. And if somebody else gets it, we're screwed.
Yeah.
It is the United States of the era is a tertiary power at that point. And so when you see the great era of American manufacturing, all basically along the Great Lakes and all of the great farming communities along the Mississippi, you basically see heavy finished goods exiting into the Atlantic and everything else exiting into the Caribbean by water. I mean, economically enormously important.
Yeah.
So anyway, there's a good deal of that in this particular story. It's kind of about a young man who stumbles upon this conspiracy and does some things to disrupt it.
Yeah.
And I've probably gotten somewhat off of where your questions were headed. So I'm going to stop a second.
No, this is great. I did want to back up for a second before we get to Rivers West, which I do have a number of questions about our protagonist and the other characters. But I think we spoke in our prior interview about in the early to mid 70s, there was kind of this buildup of the bicentennial. Which kind of propelled a lot of these stories, like your dad's books that kind of dealt more with, I think, the founding of what we then became the frontier or America during the frontier, like Rivers West, the early Sackett books. Do you believe that your dad probably saw that as a great opportunity, given what you just mentioned too about kind of being pigeonholed into that Western genre? Was this a prime opportunity for him to delve into some other story ideas that he'd had floating around?
I think he felt the winds of American culture changing. Okay, so I'm not going to tell you I'm not going to tell you he had his thumb on the of kind of youth culture in the late 60s or early 70s, but until 1973, we lived in West Hollywood, which was like the Haight-Ashbury of Los Angeles, equivalent to Haight-Ashbury, East Village, Soho in London.
Yep.
I mean, crazy, crazy, crazy beatnik neighborhood. And it was pretty clear that kind of the British invasion fad to rock and roll was changing into something that was much, much, much more American roots oriented.
Right.
And, you didn't, I mean, I can remember you know, walking to school with my dad, walking home from school, along Sunset Boulevard in West Hollywood, and you were constantly running onto people in like fringe jackets and
Yeah.
riding boots, and the girls all had Indian braids,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it was kind of hippie aesthetic was definitely that kind of thing, and I think that from some of that he recognized that the culture was opening up to accept if they could accept kind of hippies as cowboys, then then he probably could get away with writing something that took place in the colonies. Like,
Yeah.
he might be able to get away with doing the Californios, which has a little bit of
Right.
science fiction in it. Um, I think he felt that I think he realized that the old kind of very straight-laced vision of what had to happen in a Western was probably breaking down, and he
Mhm.
could do, he could do more with it at that time.
Right, right. Well, and to think about this particular novel, Rivers West, one thing that really struck me initially versus maybe some other novels, not necessarily even by your dad, but that didn't quite fit into the Western archetype as strictly as maybe they would have in the 50s, is that the main character, Gene Talon, he's not even a gunfighter. He's not, he's a shipbuilder. So, I could see like from page one, a much more a changed outlook on what the book could be. It starts with this swampy, foggy mystery feel to it in the opening pages. We have this guy who's stuck in his head about shipbuilding and all of these great things he can do, and not worried about his gun or anything like that we've come to know in these traditional westerns. And how do you see that character and this book fitting into, what I think became known as kind of your dad's philosophy of who these frontiersmen were, the types of men that made it in these untamed lands, and now even further back into the early 1820s. Um, does that character still kind of fit that mold and that philosophy of what your dad had for those other characters? Like I think of like the Tall Stranger or something or Conager. He's so different, but yet do you still see him kind of fitting into that same philosophy?
Well, he definitely gets in a lot of trouble, and has to handle violence and things of those
Right.
sort. But I think also, Dad, many times when speaking about the West, would kind of downplay the the role of many of the things that we just saw way too many times in movies, kind of gunfighters and marshals
Right.
and all that sort of stuff. And at the same time, he knew that that was the genre that he was writing in, and that those items needed to be used to fulfill the requirements of the genre, at
Right.
least most of the time. And so his own personal vision of what the West was all about and what he was writing about was kind of two different things.
Right.
One being more historically accurate. I mean, as far as we know, there were only one or two, middle of the street kind of gunfights ever, and I think one of them, the Hickok Tut fight, was in Illinois or someplace like that. It wasn't even really quite in the West, um, but uh, I think that if he had gone on with his career, if he had been, if he had lived another 20 years and maintained his health and things like that, I think he would have been writing more about other events and other types of people, because it had become possible. I know that he very much wanted to write uh, something that dealt. I know this because he was kind of uh, he had issues with the things that he had to learn in order to do this, the research that he would have to do. He definitely wanted to write something that was kind of technical about railroading and railroad
Oh,
building. And there was sort of, railroad track engineering issues and railroad train engineering, actually the driver of the train type engineering issues that he was struggling with a little bit. We talked about that because I'm kind of the techie guy in the family who went out. Sometimes when he had to know things like that late in his career, I was kind of the guy that did some of that. And I think that he was fascinated by the early days of the surveyors. So pre-Civil War, when they knew the railroads had to go in, but nobody was quite ready to build them. I'm gonna say something, and I'm probably gonna get a couple of these details wrong because it's been years since I heard it. But I believe if you're building a railroad track, say you're gonna build a railroad track from the East Coast to the West Coast, it can only manage a 2% grade, and there has to be water, thousands of gallons every 90 miles. And you think, yeah, and you're sort of like, okay, that is a connect the dots,
Yeah.
wild, wild kind of set of demands to
Right.
put on something. It's sort of like you can only do so much grade. Obviously, the track bed has to go someplace where it can handle trains that are many, many tons. You can't have too many things like tunnels and bridges, which are too expensive. And you got to have water. Now, sometimes they would bring the water in on other trains. But you had to have water available because that's really what your trains were running on. And, we talked about that, and he was kind of fascinated by, I don't really hear these stories about how difficult
Yeah.
that job was, but it must have been incredibly difficult.
Right.
So, like Gene Talon being a shipwright, he wanted to get into some other things like that. I know he wanted to also do work that took place in the era prior to the Civil War because a tremendous amount of really interesting stuff happened at that time period. But for a long time, it wasn't really considered to be the Wild West.
Right.
It was something else.
Right. Well,
So, yeah.
yeah, and you mentioned a minute ago with, telling us about the political undertones that were kind of affecting everything at that time period. That's where I really saw your dad's philosophy play through with Gene Talon as a character, even though he's not the traditional mold of a Louis L'Amour, guns, cowboy or whoever the normal average fan would assume. But it's still kind of this, it brings up, the whole book brings up this idea of, you know, can you really take the country by force? Like, Baron Torville, our
Yeah.
antagonist in the book, would do, or like Gene does, building it and creating it and
Right.
making something from it. And it struck me when I read that and read more of this story I hadn't seen in forever, because in a lot of your dad's books, that same idea comes into play as well. It's always this antagonist, whether it's the neighboring rancher or the outlaw who wants to take what he wants by force. But it's the cunning, it's the heart of the protagonist that keeps that at bay and shows another way. Do you think, looking at all of the backstories and the lost treasures features that you've looked at, did that reflect something about how your dad felt about the founding of the nation in that time period, or anything like that you were able to pull?
Oh, I think no question. I mean,
Yeah.
first of all, in entertainment, you don't really have entertainment without drama. You don't have drama without conflict.
Right.
It's very often that you don't have conflict without violence.
Right.
And so as soon as you accept that you're doing entertainment, you're looking at certain types of stories.
Right.
And the Western was driven very heavily into a certain type of story like that. But there were a lot of other things that happened. And I like the way you presented that contrast between, sort of the imperial, kind of the mercenary imperial version versus the, constructive imperial version. That kind of dueling it out in this story and in a more minor way in some of the others. There is that reality. Yeah.
Yeah. And for this story in particular, with the postscript that you're collecting for these Lost Treasures editions, when fans get the book and read this, Was there one type of postscript that was more common in this book compared to others, whether it be drafts or letters or things like that?
Well, the thing that really sets this one apart was the fact that it was so there were several books. I think it started with Sackett's Land that my dad and the publisher wanted to have. My dad basically gave his career in the early 50s over to paperback originals. He was happy to work that way, even though you didn't quite make quite as much money off of the books as you would if you started in hardcover, because the hardcover publishers would keep a lot of the money,
Mm.
and they would keep a piece of the paperback rights and stuff like that. If you went right to paperback, you kept it all.
Ah.
And so Dad was very happy to go straight to paperback, even though the cover price was less, and you made somewhat less in the early days because of that. But at this point in his career, the 1970s, he was kind of fighting for greater credibility. His sales had just kind of started to go exponential. The successful part of his career was just starting to hit, and paperbacks didn't get reviewed. If
Mm.
you wanted to be reviewed, you had to have a hardcover. And so Bantam and he put together this deal with Saturday Review Press and Dutton's, I think,
Okay.
to produce some of the books in kind of a limited hardcover release. I think that may have started with Sackett's Land.
Mm.
Um, and so uh, there was Sackett's Land, there was To the Far Blue Mountains, To the Far Blue Mountains. But what happened is when it went from Bantam, which had, I hate to say, kind of lax editorial standards, to Saturday Review Press, which had kind of more significant editorial standards, but I'm going to say maybe not better editors.
Mm.
So they weren't. I have a lot of questions about how these people were doing. I know the problems they were trying to fix, and they were right to do it. The ways that they went about it, I think, were kind of a mess.
Mm.
And they kind of made a mess out of To the Far Blue Mountains. And then they kind of made a mess out of Rivers West. My dad thought, it's not true, but when he saw it, he was sure they had cut 100 pages out of it. Okay. Now, like I said, they didn't. That was kind of his emotional reaction to it. But they had gone in and tried to fix things that needed to be fixed, and they had done it in a particularly, in my opinion, disruptive way. When I saw in correspondence that I include in the postscript that he thought 100 pages has been cut out, I was like, oh boy, I've got to go back in and re-edit this. So I went back to the original manuscript, which has got markings all over it. I mean, it's got several different generations of publishers' markings in there. Very, very hard to figure out like what happened when.
Whose
And
pen is whose?
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Because somebody had taken a bunch of stuff out, and
Okay.
then before it was initially published, certain things had been put back in.
Okay.
And this didn't have anything to do with my dad. He didn't even know it was happening at this point.
He was 3 books in
He
to
was he was he
beyond.
was way on into the future.
Right.
Exactly. And so I went back, put everything back in, went back through and re-edited it, and discovered what they were trying to fix. I think this book was being written a little bit over a year and a half earlier, when we made the move from our home in West Hollywood to our home in West LA near
Mm.
UCLA. And that was my dad tried to keep working through that, but it was really disruptive. And then he didn't have a good place to work for several years after we arrived there. And it was kind of a mess, which I describe hopefully in somewhat humorous manner in the postscript. But he got confused about where he was geographically, which is almost never. I mean, when I see my dad like kind of get a little whacked out about what's going on geography wise, that's a sign that something's wrong.
Mm.
And so I had to tweak some of that. I had to make some cut and fills in some other places, but the main goal was to get absolutely everything that I could possibly get back in that made sense back into it.
Yeah.
And and then the problem went on. We went one more book beyond that to Fair Blows the Wind, where again my dad got confused. Fair Blows the Wind occurs before Sackett's Land,
Mhm.
but in To the Far Blue Mountains, he had tried to kind of unify the two stories, and the timeline didn't work. And so if you read through the postscript to those stories, I think the postscript in that one is into To the Far Blue Mountains. Um, you'll find that I had to go in and make some changes, and then
Mhm.
all of the changes that I made are pulled out and they're put in the postscript, so you can see exactly, exactly what happened.
Right.
Um, but there was a little straightening out of things that occurred, but all that stuff was happening all three of those books were happening during the move in
Yeah.
different stages.
Yeah, it's amazing that you can see, having lived with him and lived the life that you can go in and
Yeah.
see, wow, this affected this and this changed that. And
Well, I was there,
yeah,
and he kept a journal that was pretty up, maybe 3 times a week, sometimes 4 or 5 times a week. And it doesn't necessarily refer to these things,
right,
but you can tell what's happening. You can tell what's happening in his life. You can
right.
tell what he's sort of struggling with. And same thing with some of the correspondence. So I've got all that information. So recreate. Louis
Yeah.
L'Amour's Lost Treasures is like the professional biography of Louis L'Amour.
Right.
Okay. I mean, I'll do a biography one of these days. It's coming up, but that's kind of a conventional one. This is all the material that I never would have had a chance to put in a conventional biography, because I would have to tell the story. I'd have to tell the story he was writing, and then tell the things that were about it, which would just be incredibly time consuming.
Right.
And so it's much better that it goes
Yeah.
right there, right with the thing that you're reading, so you
Right.
understand these
Well,
things occur.
and it strikes me as such a treat because I can't think of another author with the same situation as with you and your family and the ability to do these in the way that you're doing them, because F. Scott Fitzgerald, okay, great, but no one's here who lived the
No, no,
life, who
exactly,
was there,
exactly.
who understood it.
There is I think J.R.R. Tolkien's son did something
Oh,
like
Christopher,
this.
yeah,
Yeah, I'm not sure about that because I haven't read it, but I have heard that a few
right.
times.
A few less
Uh,
books to deal with there, but
yeah, yeah, yeah. Very complicated
yeah,
mythology,
very
you know.
complicated.
Yeah.
Well, and I was gonna say, I think there was a quote I saw, maybe it was on the blurb of this book about the Lost Treasure series being kind of this excavation of creativity, which I love that
Huh?
line. And I think that's so, I think because, as a casual reader of Louis L'Amour, someone might say, wow, he's been to all these places, or he's a student of history, or he's a great entertainer, and each person kind of takes their own sense of what his goal was with these books. And, for me, it's, I think it's definitely this person with such a huge imagination for history can really place himself in these time periods, and then unfortunately has to come up with a story all the other people like
Yeah,
myself can understand it through. And now that you've done this for, I think you said 30 books,
yeah.
what has that Lost Treasure series taught you about your father's, at least about his process of building stories, from the research, the travel, the intuition. What has that taught you about how he went about these stories?
Well, I think the thing, that whole history that I described about sort of changing and stretching the Western genre,
Yeah.
I didn't know that before.
Wow.
I had to pick I got partway into this, and I was like, oh my God, it's like what a vision, and a man who, you know, probably coming up with that idea in his maybe late 50s,
Right.
then saying, I'm going to take 20 years to do this.
Yeah.
I mean, you just kind of look at it as sort of like that kind of vision of going forward, that idea that he was going to, he was going to live to get to the end of it, which he did. I mean, in the last few
Yeah.
years of his life, he published a Cold War thriller, he published science fiction, he published The Walking Drum, finally. Um, and it's just like, what a vision, what kind of, almost like what courage to just say, I'm going to invest the whole rest of my life in making this slow kind of incremental change that doesn't rock the boat and, keeps me financially solvent and things of that sort. It was very, very impressive. I mean, I have to say I always had a lot of respect for him, but I had a lot more respect for him as I not only saw that plan play out, but saw kind of these incremental mentions of what he was doing. There's no place where he just says, this is what I'm doing.
Right.
It kind of dribbles out through
Yeah.
hundreds of pages of journals and correspondence and things like that.
Wow.
And so that one was probably the most kind of breathtaking vision of what he was up to. And I wish I could think of a couple of others, but I'm not coming up with a great answer.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and one question I've been dying to ask you too is, if your dad was here to see all of these rediscoveries of letters and how you've kind of taken all, what do you think he'd make of all that? Was he the type that didn't want his letters written or read or anything like
No,
that?
no. I
Yeah,
think he'd be fine with that. I think that I think he would very much rather be the guy who was still creating enough new stuff so that nobody cared about that.
yeah,
He was always about the new. He was always
yeah.
about the new.
The
He
next book.
wasn't
Yeah.
necessarily a guy who was gonna. He wasn't gonna make his career out of revisiting his career.
Right, right.
That is for sure.
Yeah.
And so, did he have some kind of sense of like he wanted all these things to be private? I don't know. I don't think so.
Yeah.
I don't think he was really worried about that kind of thing. I just think
Right.
he was all about momentum.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and we're glad he was, because there's no
Yeah,
dearth of Louis L'Amour books to fulfill your appetite for sure. And
yeah,
as you've mentioned in this podcast, beyond just traditional westerns,
right,
as
right.
spy thrillers and science fiction and all the others, and even if just like myself, fans of even the early days of short stories taking place in far off exotic locales and all of World War II and all of that, which is great too. And so you mentioned you've got, I think, a couple of books left in the series to finish up that you've got enough for. I'd love you to talk about the series and what that conclusion might look like, and then if we've got any new works. You mentioned a book next year
Right.
as well.
So more lost treasures. I know I never stay on. It's like I write these things and I send them to the publisher, and then they bring them out when they feel like bringing them out. We try to get two of them out a year.
Yeah.
And I'm never exactly sure what schedule they're on. That's how we lost Rivers West for a couple of
Oh
years
yeah.
because sort of spaced out. So I know I've got one for Son of a Wanted Man that's coming out pretty soon. And then I had to dive into doing some kind of archaeological work on the Sackets recently. And I noticed that there's probably one or two more Sackett stories that I could do a Lost Treasures on. I don't, as I said earlier, I don't ever like to do these unless I feel like I've really got something significant to
Right.
say.
Right.
And so, I don't know, there might be four more, there might be five, we might end up with 35 of them in total. And then the new book, so I don't have a contract for this yet.
Okay.
It has been submitted to Random House. I'm hoping for the best. Everybody's like going, oh yeah, next year. But this book is tentatively titled Skyring Water. It is, I say tentatively titled because the publishers always want you to keep the title open until the last minute in case they've got another book with a similar title. Okay, then they're going to say, hey, one of you guys has got to change something so that we don't have two books that have almost the same title coming out at the same time.
Right.
When you're dealing with a publisher that publishes thousands and thousands of books a year, several books a day, uh, it's kind of a big deal.
Yeah.
So tentatively titled Skyward Water, it is a post-war kind of early 1960s, like 1960, 1961 era Cold War thriller
Okay.
about a couple of arms dealers in Spain who get into a situation that is way, 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 way over their heads, uh, and end up uh, kind of being kind of hunting for an amazing treasure and being hunted all through what I kind of jokingly call the Nazi diaspora, the place where the Germans escaped to. So, places like Spain and Egypt and Venezuela and Argentina and Chile. And it deals with a lot of World War II history and post war, kind of Cold War tensions and stuff like that. And so hopefully hopefully it'll be a very interesting book. This is a book my dad left behind. He was never very happy with it when he was having troubles with Haunted Mesa. He kind of dusted it off and kind of showed me what he had of Haunted Mesa and what he had of this. And he was like going, which one should I go to? And I really encouraged him to keep going with Haunted Mesa. But I said, there are some changes that you could make with this. Some of them along the lines of other stories that you wrote, kind of more World War II adventure stories that you wrote. I said, you could leverage some of the stuff in these other stories and turn this into one of these kind of international thrillers, which in the 80s, you had Frederick Forsyth and Jean Le Carré and Clive Cussler and all these guys doing that kind of stuff. It was a very common thing. I mean, Last of the Breed was his first step into that particular market.
Right.
And so the idea was to basically recreate this as a follow up. It's not a sequel in any way. There's no characters that are the same, but a follow up in the same vein as Last of the Breed. And the people who were involved in this book, I mean, the people who helped us out, who helped my dad and I out when we first started talking about it, and then the people who helped me out with it afterwards, are just the acknowledgments to the book are crazy. Okay, I mean, I'll break one of the dedication things. So the book is dedicated to several people, but one of them is Thomas O. Paine. Tom Paine was the head of NASA during the Apollo project.
Oh, wow.
And Tom helped out. Tom had been a engineering officer on American submarines, and then the prize captain for the largest Japanese submarine that was built, that was brought back to Hawaii and investigated and then taken out and sunk before we were required to hand it over to the Russians.
Wow.
And so, he had this interesting background of submarines and then space later on in his career. But Tom was a big help with some of the submarine stuff that's in this story.
Wow.
And there's an equal, a bunch of people of equal kind of historical import that had some effect on us being able to finally produce it. So
that one might need a postscript section as well.
Like I said, it's got a postscript, and it's got acknowledgments that isn't just a list of names. I mean, I kind of explain how what role everybody played, and there's a lot of really, really incredible people that helped out.
Well, we hope to hear more about that for sure. That sounds interesting.
Very good.
Well, Beau, it's been great to talk to you. We could talk forever about your dad's work, and we're glad to keep having you back on as new books drop and new projects are greenlit, and we're excited to see the next one. And Rivers West available now. I think it just came out about a month ago now, so available in stores. So readers and listeners should go pick that up. And we'll look forward to seeing you the next time, Beau.
Thank you so much.
All right. Take care.